first verse and read about one of the earliest things of Jesus' ministry. They went to Capernaum. That's Jesus with his disciples. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. And they were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, not as the scribes. And just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. And he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. May God add his own blessing to the reading and hearing of his holy word. Well, Mark is a kind of an interesting gospel. For one thing, I guess the way that he's really described Mark is it's just the facts. Just the facts, pretty much. There's nothing real extra in it, and he doesn't even, there's no Christmas story in Mark. Do you ever pay attention to that? It jumps right into Jesus getting ready for ministry. His baptism, a couple things John says about him, his baptism, temptation in the wilderness, and then call the disciples, and here we go. And this morning is here we go, and he's in a temple in Capernaum. Capernaum is Peter's hometown, and sometimes Jesus stayed with Peter's mother at the house. He stayed there at the house that they had in Capernaum, and they actually think they have found ruins of the neighborhood where they think that house was, and you can go and see them if you ever get an opportunity. And the ruins of the synagogue are there, although it's a synagogue that was built about 200 years after Jesus was around. But it was on top of the original synagogue, so it's the right place. One of the very few places that you can go there and you can say with some certainty, Jesus was actually here when he did this thing. There are very few places where they actually know that his feet stood, and that's one of them. But here he is in this story in a synagogue in Capernaum, right on the Sea of Galilee, right on the north shore of Galilee. And I was really struck by a couple things as I read through this time that I hadn't paid attention to before. It's always been there, I was focused on other stuff. And one of those is, there were demons in the synagogue. We're to get used to hearing him healing people and things like that. And here he does this on the Sabbath, right? They're in there on the Sabbath in the synagogue, and he teaches. How many times later on does he get in trouble for healing somebody on the Sabbath? It happens, doesn't it? People make a big deal out of it, but not this time. And we're going to kind of catch back up on that a second. So there's demons in there. That kind of caught my attention. And then the idea, too, the demons knew who he was. That kind of caught my attention a little bit, too. Don't you think that it doesn't take long to figure out sometimes what a person's nature is? Sometimes these demons would have known who Jesus was, because here's Jesus who's got a different kind of a spiritual place. He's got a different spiritual connection, as it were, with God, and the demons are in that same kind of world. And while the people are still wondering, what is this all about? And they're trying to kind of define what's happening and try to understand what's happening. Here are two kind of opponents, if you will, that have already understood and know each other. Remember, Jesus was in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so these are age-old enemies that are going at it, that recognize each other very quickly. We don't always recognize the demons among us, and they're not always spirits in the same way. Back in the early 80s, I was at an evangelism conference in Nashville, and the speaker talked about like in the Bible times, the evil often manifested itself as evil spirits. And we see that in Bible stories. And there are parts of the world where they still do. Some parts of the developing world, especially in places of Africa and parts of South America. But he said in this time, in our country, it was addictions. That was back in the 80s. Addictions to alcohol and the growing addictions to gambling and addictions to drugs and things like that. Nowadays, I'm not sure what we would call it. If it's still addictions, or if it's more about fears, or if it's more about kind of a sense of arrogance where we think that we don't need God because we have all the power that we need. But all of it comes down to this idea about authority, I think, and power. and what that is. Authority, actually, this word that they use in Greek for authority is also sometimes translated as power. It just depends on the context. But the same word can be used, exousia. And so we're looking here, they say Jesus is teaching as one with authority, one with power. And he shows power over the Spirit. He commands him. The definition that you see on the front of your bulletin talks about having the influence, to be able to influence or command somebody in order to get them to do something, to make a decision, commanding their behavior, for instance, what they do. And we kind of take that thing real seriously in different ways, don't we? When we think of a teacher in a classroom, we want them to have authority, to be able to influence the children, not just to learn, but to have certain behaviors that are conducive to learning, to respecting for each other in the classroom and respecting the teacher. And if you think back to the classes you've had, every teacher is different, has their own ways to go about that. And I've had a couple that didn't do it at all. And I never did quite understand the difference for a long time. And I guess it still depends sometimes on how just people mesh. But I had a teacher in 7th grade, and it was so, I mean, the kids would throw paper, like paper wads, wadded up paper, piece of paper at her during class. And she just like, can you all stop? Please stop. She didn't take charge. Different other people have been able to they just have this presence, right? And you just know that they've got it. It doesn't matter how it comes, really. Everybody's individual. The point is not that there's a right way or wrong way. The idea is there is a time and a place in which we all recognize an authority in some manner, that somebody has some kind of power. Whether it's a policeman who forces power on someone because they need to keep the public safe, or if it's the back and forth that we've been seeing lately between us and North Korea, where we're trying to see who's got more power, who can influence what I want, what I want. We can impose ourselves on you, or they can impose themselves on us, or what. All of these games, all these things about authority and power, and the desire to have control in some manner or another. That seems like the kind of a thing that we're always engaged with in some way. It often becomes unhealthy. It's not always a kind of a situation where, we have, when it works best, we have a government where we elect people that we want to represent us, and they take the authority they get from our consent and use that to govern us in a way that is wise and fair. That's the ideal. It doesn't happen that way all the time, but that is the ideal, and we still aspire to that, don't we? Even though we may recognize struggles with it. A different way of looking at power. In the Bible, we see different kinds of samples of that too. I love the story of David and Goliath. I mean, I think everybody would call that one of their best known, if not one of their favorites. David and Goliath comes out, and I'm astounded by the story in different ways. Goliath is portrayed as someone who's like almost 10 feet tall, incredibly strong, brutal, powerful warrior, who stands before an entire army and says, I dare you to come get me. Send somebody out. Now, I don't know how we're supposed to look at war exactly altogether. There's a lot of theories and things about. I've read some of that and all that, just war theories and stuff like that. But here's what I'm thinking. If someone is invading my country and they're going to send one guy out to belittle and to threaten and everything else, I don't care how big he is, I don't feel like I've got to just send one guy out to get him. You know what I mean? If it's about war, don't you use the resources you have? Why would they keep just saying, well, we don't have anybody brave enough to face him, and just sit there looking at each other across the field for a few weeks? That just seems goofy. But he had this power by his imposing strength that he showed. And when it came down to it, it was David, the shepherd boy, who says that he's being disrespectful to God. Is anybody going to stand up for God? It wasn't about who can take him. It wasn't about who's strong enough to do it. David said, well, who's going to stand up for God? He's making fun of our God, not us. And so David stands forth with this 5 stones. Apparently he only needed 1. Pretty good shot. A slingshot and a little boy, by those standards, a young teenager perhaps, he wasn't even strong enough to put on Saul's armor. Saul the king said, here, if you're going to go out there, you can take my armor. He wasn't even strong enough to carry the armor. But he took the slingshot and went out there with a different source of power. A different source of power. And by God's power, Goliath is vanquished. It's an amazing story. There are other stories that bring the same kind of idea to mind. Moses goes to Egypt. Now think about it. This is Pharaoh. The Egyptians are at that time the single most powerful people in that known part of the world. In that known part of the world. No one's even close. They are holding the entire race of the Hebrew children as captives, as slaves. Remember the fear. The reason they turned them to slaves is because they were getting so numerous in population that they were afraid of their numbers, the sheer vastness of their people. So they enslaved them. So it took a lot of people to control a lot of people, right? Especially if they don't want to be controlled. After 400 years of unquestioned power and authority by the Egyptians, God says, now it's time for me to send Moses. Moses, who escaped the slaughter of the babes at the age of 2 in those days. Moses, who was raised in a king's palace, as it were, in the home of the Pharaoh. Think about that. Think about in the 60s in civil rights. You all know one of the biggest challenges to the people in the civil rights movement who are looking for more just ways to live among us was that they had been downtrodden so long, that's how it was supposed to be. We get used to our roles. We get used to feeling like we're supposed to be less than something. So after 400 years, who is going to be able to stand up against those who have done nothing but belittle you and keep you down? You've been raised in that for generations. That's just your place. But Moses not only escapes death, he escapes that mindset because he's raised as one with authority. He is in the family of the Pharaoh. He is a prince. So he knows how to command. And that's the person. And all of this, this show of authority and all this show of power that there is in Egypt, God raises somebody and finds a way for Moses to be given a different mindset. And then yet later, as he begins to understand who he is, to have a sense of compassion for the people. And when God sends him back, he stands before Pharaoh. Now, if someone comes up against you, or if you have to go up against somebody who's got a whole army at their disposal, don't you think it's kind of tough not to have an army with you? But God says, I'm not going to do it that way. You just tell them that tell him that I, the one true God, want you to let my people go. And what's Moses got to back it? Pharaoh's got to be laughing. Yeah, you, just you. What? But God's got his way. And God extended himself through the different kinds of plagues. And eventually Pharaoh came to understand this God has more power. It wasn't power that Moses brought. Moses only brought the word. Moses only brought the message. So that Pharaoh would understand the activity that was happening against his people. And the source of it. Where does that power come from? What is that power for? God used that same power to help those people in freedom after 40 years of their wandering in the wilderness. He uses that same kind of power to help them overrun the promised land, to take control, to take charge of that, his power. Later, he uses it to help them maintain and keep their place in that land. With Gideon, for instance, and the Midianites. God says you need to raise an army up to protect yourselves against this threat. And when all the men show up, God says that's too many, get rid of most of them, so that they know it's my power that saves them and not their own. And eventually with 300 people and some lanterns and some candles and some swords, a few, they defeat the Midianites by God's power. Jesus comes now, let's skip way ahead. We've seen those examples. Let's see, Jesus comes now, and here in And this story in the Gospel of Mark is Jesus' first exhibition of his power, of his authority. And it first comes through teaching, and then it comes by the action of healing. In this case, he heals by removing demons, by driving them out of this man. Demons in the church. Isn't that crazy? Yeah, we're not going to make too much of that. It's just we know that we all have our things that we deal with. We all have kind of, if you want to use the word that way, demons, that things that haunt us, issues that we deal with, our weaknesses, our strengths, our failures, our mistakes, all of those things. We have those, and we bring them with us here. We take them with us everywhere. And we pray, don't we, for God to relieve us of those burdens that those bring? Bring me healing, God. Help me to be strong. Help me to be faithful. And I'm sure that that was true in that case. But it wasn't until someone with authority over those demons showed up that it could be dealt with, that they could be cast aside. People began to recognize Jesus' authority as he taught. He doesn't teach like the scribes. We don't really know what that means. Other than what seems to be the case throughout the Gospels is, Jesus talks about I and the Father are one. And he seems to teach as though he were God himself. He seems to carry himself as one who has this knowledge with a certain kind of, not just a comfort with it, but a sense of an ability to direct it, to control it in a sense. And then when he casts the demons out and they say, who is this person? He teaches with authority and he has power over demons. See, in that time of the world, in that time of history, there are only two things that could cast out a demon. It was God or a stronger demon. So what they're beginning to do is put the pieces together who this person is. He teaches us one with authority and he does the demon thing. Now, if he was a stronger demon, he couldn't teach that way. They're in the presence of this miracle. And a miracle, it's not just a miracle of what he's done and said, it's a miracle of who he is. It's a miracle of who he is. To think of God being among us. There's the true authority that they began to recognize, that it was Jesus was the true power. Jesus, God in that human form, that was their vision of the true power. Remember he says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And it's hugely comforting for us because as we learn about Jesus through the Scriptures, we're learning about God. The vision we get of Jesus in the Scriptures is who God is. And it's more than just a description. It is an invitation to participate, to receive. Everything that Jesus does in his ministry is to connect us with the Father. It's what he teaches. It's what he says to people. It's how he accepts them. It's the healing he gives to them, whether it's through some kind of spiritual form or some kind of physical form. There is healing in all of these things, and it's something that either it helps us to establish that connection or to enhance that connection with the one true authority in the world. See, when we deal with power and authority in our world in the ways that we understand it, we're always dealing with what it says on the front of the bulletin. To be able to influence or to command people's thoughts or behavior, opinions. But God's authority is different. It's about being creative. It's about healing. It's about making whole. It's an authority that's rooted in his compassion and his love. And that offers itself to us. God offers that love and that compassion to us in order to bring us to himself, to bring us back to the one who made us. Think about the authority that God has is based, I think, in his ability to create through love. That's the thing. When we think about all the things we can do, that creative sense, to be able to create something, is one of the most magnificent images of God that we possess. So we talk about him being made in his image. God can make from nothing. We can do art, we can do music, we can create in all kinds of different ways. Through our thoughts, through our science, to me, these are all different expressions of creativity that are rooted in the image that God has placed within us. And Jesus helps us to connect with that. He teaches about that. He teaches by God's love. He heals us. So miracles are in us all the time. Miracles of healing in spirit, healing in mind. And if those times come where our bodies aren't healed, then there's a healing of resurrection into a new life, which is ultimately there for all of us. That authority, we can't match that here. We don't pretend to. What we do try to do as people of faith is, one, stay connected, to strengthen that connection and to do the things that we need to help that connection be strong. That's not things we need to do by earning it. It's by things we need to just be open. That daily devotion, that time for prayer, that being in church, those kinds of things, sharing with friends in terms of class or some kind of way that we do something together to support and encourage each other. To be open to God's grace and His healing and His love. That's what we get to do. And that helps us to share that with others. It helps us to help that connection. You know, the only time that Jesus got, that I read, the way I read it in the scriptures, that Jesus got either angry or in the case of the cleaning of the temple was, physically tearing things up, I guess you could say, was when the connections to God were withheld from people. When those connections were blocked, when the Pharisees and the chief priests in the temple refused or they used their money-making scheme as a way to make profit for themselves, and it got in the way of people's ability to worship God and to be connected to Him in a spiritual manner. And Jesus drove them out with anger. Jesus' whole purpose here was to connect us, to connect the world back to God and the true authority that God possesses. We like to think sometimes, I guess we do think sometimes popularly in the world, in our culture, love is a weak thing. Not as strong anyway, not as capable anyway of dealing with our circumstances, what's around us, as exhibitions of power and control. But we see God redeem people, heal people, form nations, all kinds of things by the power of His will and compassion. It turns out that love is the greatest power and force there could possibly ever be. What else is there that brings life out of nothing, out of death? What else is there that creates something out of nothing? In the beginning was the Word. That's John's gospel. And that Word was Jesus. And Jesus came so that we all might know God's love. It's all rooted in the power of God's love. Be connected to that. Be steady in your prayers. It doesn't be fancy. Just honest. I've never considered myself eloquent in terms of praying. And I bet you took a poll in here, you'd all say, that's pretty self-aware. I can live with that. I believe what I pray. I mean what I pray. That's all that matters. Remember what Moses said? God, I can't do that. I don't speak very well. God says, I got you covered. When we learn to rely on God's grace and His ways instead of our own understanding, then that connection is taking life. Have confidence in that. Wherever you lack confidence in yourself, place it in God. Because it's where we are at our weakest that He is able to give His strength. Don't hide your weakness. Revel in God's strength.